even more interesting is that it goes even further. It goes into an actual, like, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde type situation, and I'm gonna get into that later. But the murderer that we're talking about tonight claimed to actually have this alter ego, which he referred to as a monster that lived inside of his mind, and he referred to this monster as the bad man from Egypt, who would talk to him and tell him to do bad things. So I don't know if he was actually schizophrenic and he was experiencing like auditory or other hallucinations, but we'll get into that. But yeah, Arthur Warren Waite said that this bad man from Egypt, who was inside of his head, would whisper to him and tell him to commit, quote, diabolical acts. And as I said, like, whether he actually did hear voices or this was just a defense because he was terrified of going to the electric chair, I don't know, but I do have no doubt in my mind that this guy was an actual psychopath. And he did go on to commit 2 diabolical acts that he said the voice was commanding him to commit. He tried for a third, but it didn't work out. And the only reason that this guy ended up being caught was because of his wife's older brother, who had a very keen sense for this guy very early on. He had a really good sense that something was wrong with this guy, and he was right on point with that. Let me grab some tea. Okay. And the thing that drew me to this case the most was that most of the women, I usually talk about women killers, right? But most cases I talk about here on the channel are like Victorian era cases. And though this was, I think, just past the Victorian era, it's still interesting because the killer was male and he was a poisoner, which isn't seen as often, right? So I just thought it was kind of interesting. But even more interesting, of course, it was the fact that he used germs, like very scary, contagious, disease-causing germs, in order to commit these murders. So, I don't know. Get your Lysol hand wipes out. Get your bottles of sanitizer. Clean off your cabinets and your door handles, and let's get into it. So today's case, it takes us to New York City, and we are talking about Arthur Warren Waite. This man was born on December 2nd, 1886 in Canonsburg Township, Kent County, Michigan. His parents moved the family to Grand Rapids, Michigan, so Arthur and his 2 brothers could attend Grand Rapids High School. And education for their boys was something that was very important for the family because they didn't have a lot of money, so they wanted to give their boys the best chance of success, right? Now his father, Warren Waite, he was a fruit and vegetable wholesaler, and as I said, the family didn't have a lot of money. So in an attempt to help the family make ends meet, Arthur started delivering newspapers in elementary school. So I think it's pretty safe to assume that his obsession with money, which is the entire theme of this story, probably started at a very young age. So, yet again, as usual, I would say on my channel, we are talking about somebody who grew up with very little money, and they went and decided that the only way to go about getting more was to start going around and killing people. for me, that's just another reason to be terrified of the dentist, but I'm still gonna go. Anyway, he took the job opportunity in South Africa, and here as a dentist, he was making really good money, and he started investing in real estate. He bought 2 farms, and he lived in South Africa for 2 years. No, for 4 years, sorry, while working at this dental practice. was a lie. He didn't want to work, and he was not working. He was simply spending all of the money that he'd made in South Africa, and waiting for an opportunity. Like, he was basically waiting for a sugar mama. What's the word? I don't know. He was waiting for a very rich woman who he could steal money from, which unfortunately was Clara Beck. Yeah. So to him, the only logical course of action would be to marry Clara, kill her parents, get Clara to leave everything to him in her will, and then kill Clara as well. And that was exactly what he planned to do, and he started putting this plan into action. So obviously, Arthur accepts Clara's invitation to her mother's party, and he shows up in Grand Rapids looking very dapper and just he was described as very, well-traveled and well-educated, and everyone said that he even came to the party with a South African accent. After this party, Arthur and Clara begin dating, and he spends an entire year trying to convince her to marry him, and at first, Clara says no. And I have to wonder, if there was a little voice was visiting with Margaret, he met Margaret's friend, who is named Catherine Hubbs, and he literally fell head over heels for this woman in just a day or two. And this is while he was engaged to Clara. It was 2 weeks before the wedding, and he offered Catherine a night of romance, wink wink, and he actually ended up proposing to her. He proposed to Catherine, and she obviously turned him down, and she said, like, "You're engaged to Clara Beck. What the heck are you doing?" And he completely denies his engagement to Clara. He tells this other woman, "I'm not engaged. Will you marry me?" Catherine and Margaret, together, they immediately sent a letter to Clara asking, "You're engaged to Arthur Warren Waite, are you not?" And they tell her that he came onto one of them and proposed. And all Clara does is send a letter back, and she says, "Yep, I'm engaged to him," and that was it. That was all she said. The two ladies send another letter back to her, and they plead with their friend not to marry him. Like, they're saying he is a cheating dirtbag, a scoundrel. Do not marry him. And once again, Clara doesn't care. And I'm assuming it's because Arthur somehow charmed his way out of it. He probably twisted it somehow, saying that it was their fault or they were lying, but she didn't believe them. But anyway, Percy, he finds out about these letters, and on top of the gut feelings that he had already had about Arthur and just how creepy he thought he was, he again tries to dissuade his sister from marrying him, but Clara says, "No, I am going ahead with the wedding and nobody can stop me." And she even went as far as to tell him, quote, "I'll marry him if it kills me." And that foreshadowing right there, like, it doesn't really get much more sinister than that, because she almost loses her life because of this relationship. But the wedding is set for September 9th, and it is going to be at the Fountain Street Baptist Church. And the night before, Percy receives an anonymous telegram, and they never found out who this was actually from, but this is what it said. small illnesses could turn to bigger illnesses very quickly back then. So I think that's why she wanted them to get married sooner. But yeah, both of them were healthy enough that it was a very, very weird comment for Arthur to make. Like, I'm wondering if your parents have much time left. That's a very creepy thing to say. But yeah, looking back, Percy said that it was very clear that Arthur had plans to kill them very early on. Yeah. They spend their first night together as a married couple in the upscale hotel Pontchartrain in Detroit, and then they would move into a beautiful, huge apartment in Manhattan called the Coliseum Apartments, and John Beck had, of course, bought this for them. And the reason that they lived in Manhattan was so Arthur could continue working at his dental practice, which didn't even exist, but nobody in the Beck family actually knew that. So the newly married couple settle into their apartment, and Arthur Waite very quickly put his sinister plan into action. In December, Waite literally posed as a research scientist, and what he did was he went around to different labs in New York City asking if he could buy extremely dangerous bacteria samples, and he actually ended up purchasing samples of diphtheria, typhoid, and influenza cultures from a lab clerk at Cornell Medical School, and nobody even blinked an eye because he said that he was simply a researcher. And it was insane. He just walked into this medical lab that housed these extremely dangerous bacteria, bought samples, and brought them home with him. Imagine trying to do that today. I guess everyone was just extremely trustworthy back then. I have no idea. But Arthur planned to put these germs into Hannah and John's food and kill them. That was his plan. Yeah. His plan was to first put these germs into Hannah's food and drink and kill her. And then that would be one parent down, one to go, and then he would be 2 steps closer to inheriting a lot of money. A lot of money. So, shortly after the wedding, Clara's mother, Hannah, she makes a visit to New York City to visit them, and this was on January 10th. And right after she gets there, she gets really, really sick. And as I said, she had already been dealing with a few health problems here and there, but this was completely different. A man named Dr. William Porter came to their apartment to treat Hannah after she got sick, and he said that, quote, "She was very ill, showing every evidence of Bright's disease. I treated her accordingly, but she did not respond to the treatment." Bright's disease is inflammation of the structures of the kidney that produce urine, and Bright's disease can eventually lead to kidney failure. And this is what her symptoms looked like. So, Hannah had been with Clara and Arthur for about 3 weeks at that point. Dr. Porter came and saw her and attempted to treat her, but then she died 2 days so much trust in him, but they did. And he told them that Hannah had told him. He told them that Hannah had told him that she didn't want an autopsy and she wanted to be cremated. So Arthur Waite quickly set to work showing the family that he was now part of the Beck family, and he took the initiative to get her funeral going so no one had to lift a finger. And yeah, while Hannah's husband and Clara and Percy were mourning, it was here, shortly after she passed, that Arthur told the family, Hannah told me in confidence that she wishes to be cremated, which again was such a weird thing, because you would think that Hannah would have told that to her husband and her children, not to her new son-in-law. But the family takes what he says at face value, and Arthur himself takes Hannah's body to a Detroit crematorium and brings back the ashes where Hannah is buried at the Oak Hill Cemetery. So she was cremated, and the family did their best to move on from this tragic event. And I don't know, part of the reason why I find him so creepy is just because of how fast he went about his plan. Because pretty much right after, only a few weeks later, Arthur goes to a pharmacist in New York and he buys some arsenic. And at this point, unlike in a lot of the other videos that I've done, arsenic wasn't easy to purchase at this point, like it had been in the 1800s. It was much more regulated at this time. So Waite actually went to his medical doctor and he said that he needed arsenic to get rid of a sick cat. And that doctor believed him, and he called a pharmacy on behalf of Arthur, and he said that my patient needs some arsenic to get rid of a sick cat. And the pharmacist agreed to give Arthur 90 grains of arsenic. And he tells the pharmacist, I needed to kill a sick cat, which angers me beyond belief. I don't even want to say anymore. So yeah, I'm sure you can see where this is heading, because devastated by the passing of his wife, John Beck comes to New York to mourn with his daughter and son-in-law, and this was only 6 weeks after Hannah died. And he arrives to Clara and Arthur's apartment completely healthy. He is as healthy as a horse. He's doing very good physically. But what do you know? Shortly after arriving, he gets very, very sick. How weird. Not suspicious at all. So, let's do a quick little recap. Today I'm telling you part 2 of Arthur Warren Waite. This guy, what a horrible person. Basically, he was a gold digger, which is very weird because he was male. You don't hear about that too often. He basically posed as a very wealthy, very well-traveled, very well-educated dentist, and he told everyone that he set up his dental practice in New York City. He drew the attention of Michigan's most eligible bachelorette. Her name was Clara Beck. I almost forgot the name. Clara Beck. He courted her. She fell head over heels in love with him. They got married. But the entire time, his whole plan was just to get her to leave everything that her family owned to him in her will. And then pennies, right? And Clara noticed that in the mug of eggnog that her father had just drank, there was what she described as these partially digested tablets at the bottom. And she said that it looked really weird and she had no idea what it was. But again, at the time, this was the love of her life, right? Why would she ever think that he was poisoning her father? But then she notices them again. She could see these weird tablets that she described as floating pennies. And she said that she saw them again in the tea, like the mug of tea that Arthur had prepared for her father. And they were so apparent that they actually changed the color of the tea. So they were very noticeable. was obviously getting sicker and sicker by the day, and nobody knew what was going on. And then a doctor named Albertus Moore came to the apartment to care for him, and he was there for 8 days. He came for 8 days in a row to try and look after him, and during that time, Dr. Moore noted that John was complaining of an extremely serious stomachache, and like it was described as debilitating, excruciating, just unbearable pain. But Dr. Moore, at the same time, he didn't think he was gonna die from it. He just thought he was really sick. It was awful, but he didn't expect something tragic to happen. But he wasn't getting any better either, and the medications that he was giving him weren't doing anything. John was just getting worse and worse. And then on March 11th, an old friend of John's named Dr. Cornell, he came to the apartment to visit with him, and he was a really good friend, and he was also a doctor. So while he was visiting with John, he was obviously also checking on his physical health, right? And just like with Dr. Moore, he noted that John was complaining of this horrendous stomachache. But it was after Dr. Cornell arrived that John said he had started to feel a little bit better, and his stomachache was actually starting to dissipate a little this was in like his medical opinion, which is ridiculous because again, he was a dentist. But he's like, yeah, you know, he died from heart disease or heart failure and nephritis. And nephritis is a condition in which the kidneys become inflamed and they will eventually have problems filtering waste from the blood. And it can, of course, lead to kidney failure. But nobody questions him because he was a doctor and because Dr. Moore had basically said the exact same thing. So nobody doubts them. And once again, the charming Arthur Waite steps up and he tells the family, I'm gonna take care of everything. I'm gonna do the cremation. I'll arrange the funeral. I'll take care of it all. And it's all out of the kindness of my heart. But no. But I'm sure you can guess he was only taking care of the cremation so that he could hide the evidence. Yeah. Yep. Arthur immediately takes John to a funeral home in New York, and here he is taken care of by Eugene Kane and John Potter, who were the Undertakers. Is that the correct term? I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't remember the exact term, but they are very professional, right? And they are going to do their job. They're going to do what their clients ask. But it was very creepy in the way that Arthur came there with John, because John Potter, one of the Undertakers, he was very taken aback by how demanding Arthur Waite was. Like Arthur wanted his father-in-law embalmed and taken to the train station for transport back to Michigan, and he wanted it done now. Like, he didn't want to wait 5 minutes. He wanted them to get started now. And John Potter didn't know like quite what it was that seemed so off about Arthur's demeanor, but he just noticed how quickly he wanted the whole process done and how he didn't seem sad whatsoever. There was no emotion there. And then after the embalming process, they were going to take John home to Grand Rapids, Michigan for the funeral, and immediately after, John would then have been cremated. So yeah, Arthur Waite wants him embalmed, and he wants it done now, and he says, I'm going to take him back to Grand Rapids for the funeral, and immediately after, he wants John cremated. And he tells everybody, I'll take care of it, no one has to come with me, no one has to lift a finger. And again, it's only because he needs to hide the evidence of the poisoning. And this is just an interesting side note here, but later on during the investigations, Catherine Beck, John's sister, she would tell them that she never, like not once, did she ever recall her brother wishing to be cremated. Not once. So it was very, very odd. But nobody was questioning it at the time, which Wolverine Express train with them, and they are going to travel back to Michigan, Grand Rapids, forgot the name. They're gonna go back to Grand Rapids to hold the funeral, and then immediately after, Arthur was gonna take his body to Detroit to have it cremated. But this is where things get very, very spicy, and the suspicions around Arthur are really gonna start coming to light here. So get ready. I'm gonna take a sip, but I'm gonna have that stupid frog in my throat. There it is. So as Clara and Arthur are on the train or boarding the train, a woman, and we never find out who she really was, and her identity is still unknown. A woman is rushing to get a telegram sent to Grand Rapids, and she needs this telegram to get there before the Wolverine Express, which is carrying John's body, gets there. So she's in a major hurry. She gets to a Western Union telegraph operator in Grand Central Station, and she quickly gets her message written out. And this is crazy, and I wish we knew who it was. But whoever she was, she had a gut feeling that John Beck's death was very suspicious, and she was sending this telegram to Percy Beck, John's son and Clara's brother, because she needed Percy to know that something weird was going on with her father's death. And she sends this message to Grand Rapids, which is where Percy is. On the one hand, like, it wasn't too suspicious that Hannah had died while she was visiting Clara and Arthur. Again, she was older and she could have just gotten sick, but something felt very off that only 6 weeks later, John went to visit them, and he too died. And he had not been sick at all. In fact, he had been very healthy. And I think part of those alarm bells, like part of where they came from, was the fact that Arthur was so insistent that John did not want to be buried. Arthur just kept telling everybody he wants to be cremated. And I mean, like, I know it's your son-in-law, but isn't it weird that he would not have told his own children this information, or his wife at some point? It just seems very personal, you know? So whoever this mystery woman was writing to Percy, she was very suspicious, and if her suspicions were wrong, then nothing would come of it, right? But if her suspicions were correct, then oh boy, some major crap was about to go down. So, this is what the woman's plan was. She wanted to alert Percy to her suspicions, and she wanted Percy to intercept John's body before Arthur could have it cremated, because she believed that there was more to the story, and he had not died of a heart attack. And obviously, if Percy could get to his body before it was cremated, she believed that that fact basically just kind of sealed what he already knew. Do you know what I mean? He was already suspicious of Arthur. So Percy quickly goes down to the Union Depot train station in Grand Rapids, and he meets Arthur and his sister as they are getting off the train. And he wasn't alone. Percy actually brought with him a man named Joseph Spratler, who was the local Undertaker in that area, and he was going to be the one who was arranging John Beck's funeral. So this is not good for Arthur. But because the message from Kay Adams said not to mention anything about the autopsy to Arthur, Percy doesn't introduce Joseph as the local Undertaker. He just says that he's like a friend that came with them to the train station to pick Clara and Arthur up. And later on, like after Arthur was caught, Percy recalled the shock on Arthur's face, and he relished in it because he believed that he had caught him and that his suspicions of his brother-in-law had been correct all along. Unfortunately, though, of course, both of his parents had already been killed, but Percy planned on nailing this guy for their death, and he does. Yeah. So Clara doesn't know what's going on. She just says hello to her brother and they exchange pleasantries. And Percy asks Arthur for John's paperwork, meaning like his death certificate and stuff. And Clara, of course, she's like, yeah, Arthur, get the paperwork out and give it to my brother, because she doesn't know what's going on at that point. And at this point, Arthur is like shaking in his boots because he has no idea why Percy suddenly wants to take the body. And Arthur doesn't want anybody to have the body. He just wants to bring John to the funeral and then immediately take him to the crematorium. But he can't like deny Percy's request. This is Percy's father, and he has every right to take the body, as creepy as that is, but this is what actually happened. So Arthur ends up giving the paperwork over to him, and then Clara and Arthur go to a hotel. Meanwhile, Joseph Spratler, he secretly takes John Beck back to his funeral home, and Percy phones the family doctor, Dr. Perry Shirts, and he tells him, okay, like, something very fishy is going on here, and we need you to come down to the funeral home immediately and take a look at Dad's body. So Dr. Shirts gets to the funeral home as soon as possible, and he brings a second doctor with him named Dr. Billings to help him with the examination. And once they all get together at the funeral home, it was here where Percy shares with them the ominous telegram from Kay Adams. And he asks them, do you have any idea who this could be from? And Dr. Shirt says, no, like, I don't know anybody named Kay Adams, but he wanted to bring another doctor in on this secret meeting just simply because of the strangeness of all of it. And the next doctor that they bring in, his name was Dr. Cornell, and he was also a really good friend of John Beck's when he was alive, and they thought that he might be able to solve the riddle of who Kay Adams was. And Dr. Cornell, he didn't know for sure who Kay Adams was or something very weird is going on with John's death, and now he has this group of doctors in on it, and they are about to crack this crazy case open. And of course, it's going to start with the autopsy. So, be forewarned, it's not graphic, but it's an autopsy. So good. So as they're talking at the funeral home, it was here where Percy also shares with them some of the stuff that Clara had told him during John's illness. Like, remember, she said that John had first gotten sick at their house after eating the ice cream, and then thinking back on it, like, every instance of sickness came on right after John had eaten, and immediately the light bulb goes off, and Dr. Schertz is suspicious that John could have been poisoned with arsenic. And yeah, like, as they keep talking and Percy relays everything that had gone on, he had had the classic symptoms of nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea when nobody else in the house had gotten ill, and he went from being very healthy to having a heart attack and dying. And Dr. Schertz tells Percy if he actually died of a heart attack, Schertz removes the kidneys to get a really good look at those, because again, like it was written on John's death certificate, he had died from heart failure as well as nephritis. And guess what? Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, the kidneys were fine. They were completely fine. There was zero evidence of kidney disease. However, there was major evidence of poisoning. John's body was riddled with poison. It was riddled, and the doctor said that his stomach looked like something awful had happened to it. And this is a direct quote from the book that I read on this case, which I will link down below. Quote, "The stomach was contracted into the shape of an hourglass and was fiery red in color. Dr. Schertz gently turned the end of the stomach inside out. The inside surface was mottled with dark purple patches where something had eaten away the mucous membrane. There was also a fine white powder at the center of each darkened spot. It looked like poison." But there was one problem. In the 1900s, it was very common for doctors to use embalming fluid that was full of arsenic. So basically what this meant was that even if Arthur had poisoned John, there was a chance that he could get away with it, because the doctor who had prepared John's body, who had originally embalmed him, there was a chance that he could have used embalming fluid that had arsenic in it. And apparently, even though this type of embalming fluid was banned in many states at that point, apparently a ton of doctors still used it, like under the table. Maybe it was cheaper or something, I'm not really sure. But that was one thing that they were worried about. They were convinced that John had been poisoned, but they were really worried that the poisoner might get away with it because of this. But as the doctors had promised Percy, they packed John's heart, his kidneys, the stomach, as well as portions of his intestines into jars. And because they knew that they had a criminal case on their hands, they were not going to risk any tampering with this evidence whatsoever. So it was Dr. Schertz himself who took the jars of organs. He took them on a train that night himself, and he delivered them right to Dr. Vaughn in Ann Arbor. And yeah, they were going to get them tested properly for arsenic poisoning. And Dr. Vaughn would know. He would be able to know whether it was poison from ingesting it while John had been alive, because had that been the case, the poison would have traveled up to his brain, and it just would have been taken up and processed differently by the body while he was alive, right? Compared to the way that it would have traveled through his body during the embalming process. So it was going to be quite obvious. It was going to be black and white. They would know whether he was poisoned or not. So if they found arsenic in the organs, especially in his brain, that would prove that John Beck had been poisoned with arsenic while he was alive. And it could not have been from the embalming fluid. So that was key. That was key, because I'm pretty sure they had already anticipated at this point that whoever had poisoned him, they would probably attempt to blame it on the embalmer. But nope, not a chance in hell his wife and brother-in-law, like, watching the clock, and he is waiting for John to be delivered back to the house. And he's going to be delivered to the house, of course, for the funeral, but that's just not happening, and he doesn't know why. So Arthur ends up phoning Dr. Spratler, remember him, and he asks him, what is going on? Like, where is John's body? We gotta get him here for the funeral. Tick, tick, tick. Like, we gotta get him back here in time for the funeral, even though it's not for another couple days. It's not like I'm worried that you're gonna discover that I murdered him or anything. We just need to get the body back here now. I wish I could go back in time and see the look on this douchebag's face during that So this guy was an expert, and he could see the arsenic just by looking at the organs. But of course, he went ahead and actually ran the tests. Okay, so next I'm gonna get into the funeral because oh my god, this guy was just so bold. Like, he was so bold in the way that he thought he was gonna get away with this. It's mind-blowing. Let's talk about the funeral now. Oops. So on Tuesday, March 14th, John Beck's funeral was held at his home in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and it was a man named Reverend Wishart who held the funeral, which is really sad considering that this was the same man who had married Clara and Arthur. Very sad. Now, Clara, she actually didn't attend the funeral. She was just too overwhelmed with everything, and I would imagine losing both parents in such a short amount of time would do that, so it's very understandable. So she simply stayed in the hotel with Arthur, and I can only imagine that Arthur was happy not to have to go and put up that fake persona of his, right? But kinda luckily, this gave Percy the perfect opportunity to kind of discuss what was happening with his investigation, and he wanted to discuss this with Reverend Wishart. So, and this was pretty interesting because I guess before this guy became a reverend, he had actually bought a newspaper called the Trenton Daily Times, and he had almost been like a reporter slash investigator. Like, he wasn't an actual investigator, but he had experience investigating serious cases for articles for his newspaper. So I'm assuming this and the fact that he had been really good friends with John was the reason for why Percy shared everything with him. they found it very creepy how fast he wanted the embalming process done, but there was something like even creepier, very creepy. Okay, so a quick little recap for part 3. Arthur Warren Waite had murdered his mother and father-in-law, with his grand plan being to take out their entire family. And once that was done, he believed that he would inherit his wife's family's fortune. And he did this master plan by using a mixture of deadly germs as well as arsenic. But luckily, a telegram had been sent to Percy Beck, who, remember, was the son of John and Hannah Beck. And this telegram suggested that their deaths had not been natural and were likely the result of murder. This telegram prompted Percy to begin looking into their deaths. Percy quickly took action and got a group of people together, including doctors as well as a reverend who used to basically be a detective. And all of them had been friends with John Beck, and they all began investigating the deaths of John as well as Hannah. And where we left off in the last video was with Reverend Wishart and Dr. Schultz, who had just learned about their friend's death possibly being a murder. And they had just traveled from New York to Michigan to begin their own investigation. And they start by going to the funeral home where Arthur Waite had suspiciously rushed his father-in-law immediately after his death. It was very weird how quickly he wanted the process to get started. Arthur wanted his father-in-law embalmed at like lightning speed. The reason being was that he needed to hide the evidence of his poisoning his father-in-law, and the two Undertakers there remembered very well how creepy Arthur had come off, like how quickly he wanted the embalming process started, and just how unbothered he was by his father-in-law's death. He was acting really, really strange. So that is the end of the recap. Let us continue. So one of the creepiest parts of this case, and I'm not going to go into too much detail here, was one of the major red flags that John Potter, the Undertaker, noticed about John Beck while he was in the funeral home. So this is very sad, obviously because it's true crime, but it's also scientific, and that's the reason that I'm going to go into it. After the embalming, John Potter noted that John was still, quote, and this was a scientific term, at least then, he was limp. And he explained that after the process of preparing somebody for a funeral, rigor mortis would have set in very quickly, meaning John should have been the opposite. He should have been stiff. But John was not. Even 5 hours later, he was very limp, which was really odd. It didn't make any sense. And apparently, what this meant was that the embalming fluid had been counteracted by something that was already in John's system at the time of his death. And it counteracted what the embalming fluid was meant to do. And arsenic was one of the things that absolutely could have done this. So basically, Wishart and Dr. Schultz were already on their way to gathering some serious evidence that was pointing to murder. Next, they went and spoke to the doctors who had come to the apartment to see both Hannah and John while they were sick. Dr. Porter tells them everything about the Bright's disease and how Hannah hadn't responded to his treatments. Again, he believed that it had been kidney disease, but he did mention that he thought that her death was pretty darn sudden. And then when they spoke with Dr. Moore, who had treated John, again, he believed that the death was unexpected just in case he hadn't prescribed any medicines with arsenic in them. Next, they traveled to Dr. Cornell's house to question him about everything. About March 11th, the night that he had visited with John Beck, and they want his opinion on the telegram that had been sent to Percy. Remember? And I believe I mentioned that this is the juicy little nugget that I said that I would come back to in the previous portions of this video. Dr. Cornell tells them that he has a suspicion that Kay Adams might very well be his own niece or nephew. Firstly, he believed it could have maybe been his nephew, and this was the reason why. His nephew had told him about a very weird encounter that he had had with Arthur Waite in New York City. He told his uncle that he had gone out to lunch several months prior in New York. He walks into the Plaza Hotel restaurant, and what do you know? There's Arthur Waite. He sees him having lunch there as well. And they know one another, so great, he goes to say hi. But weirdly, Arthur Waite doesn't really look too happy to see him coming up to him. Doesn't really seem pleased to run into Arthur Swinton. Can you guess why? It was because Arthur Waite was having lunch with a very, very beautiful woman. Just the two of them, this nice, intimate lunch. And it was not his wife, Clara. Nope. Arthur Swinton said that it was very obvious that Arthur Waite was visibly uncomfortable, like he had just been caught doing something really bad with somebody that was not his wife. But he quickly explained to Swinton that this beautiful young woman that he was with was his nurse, who worked with him in his dental practice. He says, yeah, we just finished this huge, really important surgery at the office, and we needed a break. So here we are, having lunch together at the beautiful, romantic Plaza Hotel. There's nothing suspicious going on whatsoever. So Arthur Swinton tells his uncle about this weird encounter where it was pretty clear that he had been having lunch with somebody that he probably shouldn't have been. And Dr. Cornell now believes that the telegram from Kay Adams could have potentially been from his nephew. Because again, this meeting at the Plaza Hotel left a really bad taste in his mouth. But keep in mind, he also believed that it could have been from his niece, Elizabeth, who again, Dr. Cornell had confided in about the iciness of Arthur Waite after John had died. That, combined with the fact that Arthur had been purchasing these germs as a dentist. He was not a researcher. He was not a medical doctor. That made him seem very guilty. And from the beginning of researching this case, I had personally believed that it was Elizabeth who had sent the telegram. And I think that Cornell's nephew had probably also spoken to her about catching Arthur cheating at the Plaza Hotel. And then Elizabeth paired that information with the iciness from Arthur after John's death. And then that, combined with the fact that he had also purchased dangerous germs, I think it was just this huge ball of murderous information and all it's just really hot still. 4 days after John Beck passed, Clara and Percy were called to have his will read to them. So obviously, Percy and his wife, and Clara and Arthur come together to hear what their father has left for them. John Beck leaves his entire fortune to both of his children, to Percy and Clara, and it is split right down the middle. And at the time, it was about $500,000 each. So I believe, it was a real quick Google search, but I believe that would be about $16 million each today. So it's a lot. pun intended. He was poisoning Aunt Catherine's opinion of her nephew, and if he was doing that, he was likely trying to ruin their relationship and turn Catherine against Percy. And if he was able to do that, then she might cut Percy out of her will and leave everything to Clara. And then boom, when Clara died, everything that Catherine owned would go to Arthur. So that was his grand plan. Hold on. Chamomile tea time. If you thought that that was bad, the moron took it even further. He walks up to Ella, who is Percy's wife, and he said this, quote, "You know, I am afraid that this is telling on Percy. I have been watching him the last few days, and I can see certain symptoms in him that were so evident in his father's last sickness. I don't want to scare you, Ella, but I don't believe that Percy will live 6 months." Unquote. So this guy has literally just told Percy that he is planning on killing his sister, and he has basically admitted to plotting the death of Percy as well to his own wife, to Percy's wife. And Percy is a smart guy. He knows immediately that Arthur is going to kill his sister for her money, and he now realizes that this was his plan all along. John Beck leaves his fortune to the kids, and now when Clara dies, Arthur is gonna get her whole share. And if you think that Arthur is gonna pump the brakes for a little while, take a little break between murders, you would be dead wrong. Another pun not intended. He's not gonna wait a while before the next phase of his plan, aka murdering the entire Beck family to get his money. He starts right away. Arthur and Clara head back to their hotel room, and on their way back to the hotel room, Arthur is just going on and on, talking to Clara, and he's telling her that he is just so saddened by all of this horrible death that is suddenly surrounding them. And he tells her that he is absolutely terrified of exiting the world with an untimely demise. And all of a sudden, he is just so worried that if he were to die tonight out of nowhere, well, he wouldn't have had the chance to write a will and leave everything to his darling Clara. So he says to her, "I think it would be a good idea if I made my will, leaving all I have to you, and I think it would also be a good idea if you did the same and left everything that you have to me. That way we're both covered and we don't have to worry." Oh, you're so caring, Arthur. You're such a good husband. Oh, my heart. And Clara obviously agrees. She still has no idea what is going on, and making wills isn't fun, but it's just something that you have to do. And Clara is probably thinking, yeah, of course, we'll get on that first thing tomorrow morning, or maybe next week. Nope. Arthur sits her down at the hotel desk in their room, and he asks her to write out her will right then and there on the hotel stationery. And I'm sure it was a combination of the fact that she was heartbroken, emotional over the death of both of her parents, and everything combined. But she agrees, and she writes her will out, and she leaves everything to Arthur, except for $40,000. And that didn't make Arthur happy. Oh, he didn't like that. Not one bit. The will that she writes stated that $40,000 will go directly to charity, and today that would be about $1.3 million or so. So that was a lot. She was incredible. So Arthur picks up the will, reads it out loud, and he sees that she wants to leave $1.3 million of her $16 million to charity. And he is absolutely pissed. How dare she? Convinces her to redo the entire will, where she will only leave Measured and Dr. Schultz are still going strong in their investigation, but now they decide to hire a real investigator to help them dig up some actual tangible proof. They speak with a detective named Raymond Schindler of the Schindler National Detective Agency, and at first he doesn't immediately say like Arthur's guilty, which I guess is a good thing. He's a detective, he's not biased, he's thinking critically, but he definitely agrees to take the case on. The first thing that they do is contact Percy, and because of Wade's comments to Percy about how he feared for his wife's life, they realize that it's probably a good idea to keep Clara away from Arthur for her own safety. So Percy tells his sister, hey, I need you to stay in Grand Rapids for a few more days just to sign some paperwork. It's just paperwork in order to receive our inheritance. So it sounded pretty legit. And shockingly, Arthur wasn't suspicious of this at all. And he got on the train and he went home to New York alone. And back in New York, Detective Schindler is doing some really good work. Like, put yourself in for a raise, because he learns that not only is Arthur not registered with any medical facility or hospital in New York, get this, he is also not licensed to practice as a dentist in New York. But that was nothing, because he soon also finds out that he doesn't even have a dental practice. There is no dental practice. Arthur Waite had been lying about this the entire time since he had returned from South Africa. That beautiful woman that he had been having lunch with at the Plaza Hotel, who he claimed was his nurse. Nope. Nope. They had been having an affair at the Plaza almost every single day. Arthur had rented a room there for almost an entire month, from February 21st to March 18th, and they had spent every afternoon there together. God. And that was literally what Arthur had been doing every single day. Or should I say, who? He was just hanging out at the Plaza Hotel with his mistress. He and Clara would wake up, and Arthur would go to work at his dental practice. But in reality, he was just playing tennis. He was having lunches and dinners and bringing women to the Plaza Hotel for dates. And it was very easy for Schindler to expose all of this. Like, he was able to go to tons of different bars around the city, and he spoke with multiple bartenders who confirmed that Arthur had spent all of his time in their establishments every day. Wade was known to them as a big spender who constantly brought beautiful showgirls to their bars, their restaurants, their nightclubs. He loved showgirls, just like regular girls. He wanted the really fancy ones. After gathering all of this information and talking with countless witnesses, Detective Schindler is now pretty suspicious that Wade has something to do with the Beck's deaths. But just some witnesses' testimony from bartenders and other people wasn't really enough. Like, obviously that's just circumstantial evidence, right? But Schindler was so certain that Wade was indeed a murderer that he called Judge Edward Swan. And all of them, like every person working on this case so far, they get together and they all talk about the suddenness of the deaths, how Wade was acting so cold towards them, acting so strange, how he wanted to rush the cremations, how arsenic was indeed found in the organs, and of course just how Arthur Wade stood to gain so much money in the event that Clara died. But unfortunately, of course, this was all still circumstantial. None of this actually linked Arthur to the deaths. They needed more solid proof, and the judge tells them, go and find it, because they are really certain that it is him. So now they have to go and find this tangible proof to nail this guy. And a good place to start in his apartment. But they have to do it quickly because remember, Waite is due back in New York at any minute. So his apartment is where they head next. And they find some good stuff in there. They get to the apartment and they start looking around for clues to link Waite to the deaths. They find some very, very good evidence. The main thing that they find are glass slides, microscope slides with cultures on them. And these things are labeled typhoid. The dude had typhoid cultures in his apartment, just laying around. And he was a dentist. He was not a medical doctor. There was no reason for him to have typhoid cultures casually laying around in his apartment. They also find a medical textbook, and Waite had bookmarked the chapter on arsenic, specifically the section talking about the effects of arsenic on the human body. So that's interesting, Arthur. Another section that he had bookmarked was on something called expectorants. They also find a hidden packet of cocaine that was taped to the back of a photograph of Clara and Arthur. And this was found to be the cocaine that Waite had used to finish Hannah. And it would later come out during the investigation that Hannah's pupils had been very dilated right before she died. So it was very likely that Arthur had overdosed her, and that was how they linked that together. Before they left, they installed a bug on Waite's phone so that they could listen to everything that he said on every phone call. Their next move was to actually follow Arthur. So they knew that his train would be getting to Grand Central Station at 9 a.m. and they got there in time to hide and follow him just to see where this little weasel was gonna go and what he was up to. The second that Waite got off the train, he ran for a phone booth. So Detective Schindler quickly went into the phone booth next to him to listen. And he overhears Waite ask the operator to connect him with the Plaza Hotel. When he's connected, Waite asks for room 1105, and he tells whoever answers to, quote, "Pay the bill and get out quick. I cannot meet you anymore at present because I am being shadowed," unquote. So he was obviously calling his mistress, and she was waiting for him at that very moment in the hotel. Ew. At that point, Waite was pretty spooked, and he quickly grabbed his bags and rushed out of the train station. Detective Schindler and Reverend Wishart follow him, and he goes directly to the apartment building. And while they're following him, one of Schindler's men go to the Plaza Hotel to find out who was staying in room 1105. Like, this person obviously knows Waite, and they might have valuable information about the case. When he gets there, he questions the clerk working there, and he finds out that room 1105 had been occupied. As I already mentioned, it had been occupied for an entire month, and the couple registered there were called Dr. and Mrs. A.W. Walters. He shows a picture of Waite to the clerk, and she confirms that A.W. Walters was indeed Arthur Waite. When Waite arrives home, he finds a nice little surprise waiting for him. He finds John Potter, the guy from the funeral home who Waite had originally brought his father-in-law to. Remember when he wanted to very quickly start the embalming process, he was waiting for Arthur to get home, and he was there to collect payment for the work that he had done in such a rush. And this would have been fine until John Potter says to him, quote, "Sorry to show up like this, but I heard about the investigation going on with John Beck's death, and I'm just a little nervous that I might not get paid for my work," unquote. I remember up until this point, his phone. So they wanted to hear everything and record it. So this phone call was essential. So Wishart, he tells Frank that he is a health officer and he desperately needs to get in contact with his brother. And he says that it is an urgent matter because there's been complaints going around that Waite has been practicing without a license. And his brother goes like, "Oh my god, that's not true. Of course. Let me get him on the phone for you so you guys can get this all cleared up." He calls Waite and he is able to connect his brother to Wishart. Wishart tells him the same thing. He says, "Hi, I'm from the health department and I need to talk to you because there are complaints going around that you're practicing dentistry without a license." And Waite confesses. He says, "I've never actually practiced dentistry here." And then Wishart asks him, quote, "So you lied to your family and friends?" unquote. And Waite tells him, "Yep." And then on top of that, he actually admits that every day while he was at work, he was just hanging out at the Plaza Hotel with his girlfriend. That's what he was really doing. So they are getting pretty close to nailing this guy for what he had done. But Arthur wasn't going to give up that easy because he had one more trick up his sleeve. So Arthur did have some medical training, right? And he knew that had they done an autopsy on John, they would definitely find arsenic in his body. But Waite also knew that maybe he had a chance to get away with this if the Undertaker had used embalming fluid with arsenic in it. Because remember, and this was great, Arthur doesn't know at this point that they'd already done the autopsy. They had already found the arsenic, and they had already sent it off to an expert who knew that the arsenic had been ingested prior to death. But Arthur doesn't know that, and he is going to try and move things once again in his favor. And he does this by attempting to bribe the Undertaker. This guy, Arthur meets with Eugene Oliver Kane, who was the other funeral director that worked with John Potter. And it was Kane who had originally done the embalming of John, so it was he who could have technically used embalming fluid with arsenic in it. Waite literally gives this guy $9,300 in cash, and he tells him this. He says, "The district attorney is going to be contacting you about John Beck's death. There's an investigation going on. I am somehow caught up in this mess, and they believe that there is foul play going on. They're gonna ask you for a sample of the embalming fluid that you used on Mr. Beck, and I need you to give them a sample of it and make sure that that sample contains arsenic." And then he says, "There's just one more tiny little thing. It's really not a big deal. If you do happen to be called to court, I need you to testify on the stand under oath that you definitely did use arsenic in your embalming fluid. You have to tell them that you absolutely did, and that's why John Beck had arsenic in his system. You know, even though it's illegal for you to do so, I need you to do that for me. Okay, so can you guess what he does right after greasing/paying off this Undertaker? He sends a telegram to Percy demanding that he do an autopsy of John, saying that the autopsy will absolutely prove his innocence. That was how cocky this guy was. He was cocky. He says once they do an autopsy she did indeed find a little weird. In particular, was Arthur's insistence that John wanted to be cremated. Because again, he had never told his sister this, which was very strange to her. On Tuesday, March 23rd, another team of investigators arrived in Grand Rapids. They were there to continue doing in-depth interviews and work on digging up more incriminating evidence on Waite. But most importantly, this was the team that would conduct the second autopsy on John Beck. This was the one that would confirm whether he had arsenic in his brain, which was crucial to the murder case. A small group, including a pathologist named Dr. Otto Schultz, head to Oak Hill Cemetery, where John Beck had been resting in a crypt, which again was guarded by security hired by Percy just to make sure that Arthur didn't tamper with the evidence. They then take him to the Grand Rapids funeral home, where, without going into too much detail, they get portions of his brain, and Dr. Schultz takes those samples to Ann Arbor to again have Dr. Vaughn test them for arsenic. When Dr. Schultz is in Ann Arbor, the rest of the investigative team keeps working, and they find so much dirt on Arthur Waite. They are talking with his old fraternity brothers, they're corresponding with his employer from South Africa, they're talking to old teachers, old acquaintances, and they find out everything. They discover the cheating all through school, through post-grad, how he had been stealing from Wellman and Bridgman, and one of the investigators literally said that it was clear when Waite had come back from Africa, he was, quote, Heiress hunting, so that he would never have to work a day in his life. By the end of the day, this investigative team receives a telegram from Ann Arbor. It's from Dr. Vaughn and Dr. Schultz, and they have, without a doubt, confirmed that John Beck died from arsenic poisoning. It was in his brain, and there was no other explanation. So this is exactly what they had been waiting for, and they wire that information to Judge Swan. Now the judge knows that it was Arthur, without a doubt, but he still needs more proof, directly proving that it had been Arthur who had given the arsenic to John. And luckily, he had Arthur Waite's maid, who had seen with her own eyes, seen Waite add something to John Beck's food and drink. So the team asks her to come and give another full statement about what she had witnessed. Dora Hellier agrees, and she spills everything. And the entire conversation was recorded, and this is what she said. Quote, I had been cooking dinner. I had just poured out the soup when Dr. Waite came into the kitchen. He had something in his hand. It was a vial. I had poured out 3 plates, one for Mrs. Waite, another for her husband, and a third for Mrs. Waite's father, Mr. Beck. While I was putting 2 plates on the tray, Dr. Waite got near the table where the tray was, and holding the vial in his hand, he poured something from it in the 3rd plate of soup. I did not know what to make of it, and I said nothing. With that, Dr. Waite, said to me, this is some medicine for father. Then he waited a second or so and said to me, Dora, you taste that soup and see whether it is too hot or not. We can't give it to him too hot because his mouth is sore. I tasted the soup. No, I didn't taste anything funny at all. No, I didn't get sick either. There was nothing peculiar to my mind. After that, I took the tray with the 2 plates of soup in the dining room and put 1 plate in front of where Mrs. Waite was seated and the other in front of her husband's place. Then I got the other plate in which Dr. Waite had poured what I call the prescription from the little bottle that I had never seen before, and I put that plate in front when I saw Mr. Waite take the same bottle or vial with the stuff in it from somewhere, and he poured some of it into the tea that I had just poured out for Mr. Beck. Dora, said Mr. Waite, Father did not like this soup, so I will have to put some more medicine in his tea. And he did. After Dr. Waite had finished his pouring, I put some cream into the tea for Mr. Beck, and I placed the cup in front of him in the dining room. I don't know whether he took any of the tea or not. I was pouring a second cup of tea for Dr. Waite. His wife did not care for any that evening. That is all I know about that. So they almost had him. They proved that John had died from arsenic poisoning. They had testimony from the maid saying that she had witnessed Arthur spiking John's food and drink with an unknown substance. And now all Swan needed was proof that Arthur Waite had purchased arsenic. He still needed to find the pharmacist who would have sold this arsenic to Waite. But luckily, the investigation team had found enough on him already to arrest him, and Judge Swan received a telegram that read the following. Arthur Waite immediately, evidence of guilt overwhelming, obtained substantial amounts of money on false pretenses, check up bank accounts, and hold up all deposits. So they went to Arthur's apartment to make the arrest, but Arthur already knew that they were coming. After the second autopsy, the press was going crazy with this story, and there had been article after article coming out about the poisoning of the Beck family. One of the articles that came out mentioned how the Becks were murdered, but then the likely plan was to murder a third victim in order to obtain half of the Beck's fortune. So the article didn't actually mention Arthur by name, but it was pretty clear that it was about Arthur. And that was where Arthur decided to take a little nap and not to wake up, because his ego was too big. He was not going to allow himself to get caught. So he took a bunch of sedatives before police could get to his house. Detective Cuniff, who was part of Swan's investigative team, goes to Arthur's apartment to arrest him. But surprisingly, it was Arthur's brother, Frank, who answers the door. Frank says that he had gotten there an hour ago and Arthur was really out of it. And that, of course, had been from swallowing a handful of sedatives. Frank immediately calls Dr. Moore, who gets there and bumps his stomach, which saved his life, but he was still really out of it. He was absolutely still being arrested, but they had to wait because he was now in a coma from all of these drugs that he had taken. After this gets out, the press went crazy, and they do an interview with Catherine Beck, who is now willing to talk with them. And at this point, she is still shocked, but she finally now believes what everybody had been telling her, and she said, quote, "All I know about our transaction is this, that I gave him money said about him. Say to him that no matter what happens, I shall always be his loving wife. Tell him, please, that the happiest moments of my life have been spent with him. I love him, oh, ever so much." End quote. This was the love of Clara's life. And just imagine for a second your partner being arrested for something like that. And of course, you're not going to believe what everybody is saying about them either. The thing that I can't get over is that Clara was willing to forgive the cheating, which to me was pretty mind-boggling because it wasn't just the one night. Like, this woman he was with was like his second wife. They spent every day together while Arthur was pretending to be at work. She told Arthur's father to tell him that she knew about all the reports. She knew about the other woman, and to tell him that even if it's true, even if he had been cheating on her, she forgives him, and it made no difference. She said it was all the other woman's fault for getting in their way and trying to destroy their happiness, and that she understood that this woman simply wouldn't give Arthur up. She believed that the other woman was the one destroying their marriage, coming between them, which I mean was true, but I feel so bad for Clara, but I also kind of feel like she had on a pair of rose-colored glasses and they were just a little too tinted, you know? Like, come on. After his arrest, investigators go to Waite's safety deposit box at the bank, where they find some really interesting nuggets. It was here where they found out exactly what Waite had done with all of Catherine's cash and stocks, because Waite had kept all of the receipts, so the evidence for them was right there. They find a bunch of love letters also between Waite and all of these Broadway showgirls, so he really was living up to the Playboy lifestyle, as they were calling it. And then they find the receipts showing that Waite had purchased those deadly bacteria from labs around New York. And it was here with these where investigators finally find the pharmacy, as well as the pharmacist that had sold Arthur arsenic on March 9th. And right after this, they get word from a tailor in New York who tells them that on February 23rd, John Beck had come to him to get a new suit. And it was here where John Beck complained to him about a stomachache. The tailor told him to go to a doctor, and John said, "No, that's okay. My son-in-law, who is a doctor, gave me some medicine." They have everything that they need now. They have proof that John was poisoned. They have proof that Arthur had purchased arsenic, and proof that he had administered it to John. At this point, Waite was still at home because he was so messed up from the drug overdose, so they're not going to move him until he's doing better. But Judge Swan, the investigative team, police, all of these people are just crammed into his apartment with him, waiting for him to basically wake up, waiting for him to basically get back to normal. I don't know. But Swan confronts him in his apartment with all of the evidence that they have against him. He shows him the receipt for the arsenic, and Waite tries to spin the murder of John Beck as a suicide. Yeah, as a suicide. Swan asks him why he bought arsenic, and Waite says to him, quote, "I'll tell you, but you won't believe me. My father-in-law was an old man and very despondent since the death of his wife. He told me that with her gone, he did not want to live any longer, and he wanted me to get him some poison that would kill him. I am not sure that he said what kind of poison he wanted, but he must have mentioned arsenic, because I bought arsenic. This was about 3 days before he died." Arthur claims what was likely gonna happen next. She realized that she would have been the next victim, and she immediately rewrote her will so that there was no way that Arthur could get anything, no matter what happened next. That's a lot. That is a lot. So Arthur survived his own poisoning, and police moved him to Bellevue Hospital. And on March 28th, his brother Frank came to visit him and got his brother to confess to murder. And he wanted him to do this in order to try and avoid his brother dying in the electric chair. And Arthur admitted it. He admitted to poisoning John. The arsenic hadn't been for a sick cat, which was one of the excuses that he had. He had planned to kill John with it, and he admitted to poisoning Hannah with the germs. He also admitted to planning the murder of Clara and taking her fortune. And then he confessed that his future plans were to move to Paris with his girlfriend, Margaret. And Margaret was the woman that he had been living with at the Plaza Hotel. He even went so far as to say that Margaret was his real soulmate, not Clara. During a second sweep of Arthur's apartment, they found 180 glass slides of other deadly bacteria and viruses that he had bought from labs around the city. And it became very clear that while this is how he had originally made Hannah sick, the germs no longer worked when he tried them again 6 weeks later on John, or so it's thought. They had lost their potency. Whatever happened, they didn't kill John. It's likely that the germs had died. They were no longer in a lab under the ideal conditions to thrive, and that was why Arthur had moved on to arsenic. He had also, upon realizing that they were not working, he tried